Sup guys, I'm back from the dead. As in I'm back from that soul-crushing canon event we college students call finals. Man, I imagined as an adult I would have a lot more free time to pursue my hobbies, but nope. Just no. Also, I kidnapped a study room at my old high school to film this. Sorry, children. So today's video is going to be a recap of part 2 of Hans Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations. Now, for those of you out of the loop, Hans Morgenthau was a German Jewish intellectual who fled Nazi Germany to the US and worked at a series of US universities. In 1948, while Morgenthau was an associate professor at the University of Chicago, he wrote his magnum opus, Politics Among Nations. Probably the single most defining, revolutionizing work about international affairs. Taught at over 100 of the US's most prestigious universities, Politics Among Nations is the defining book about classical realism and would shape the policies of many American policymakers, including Kennan, Walter Lippmann, Reynold Neubar, I hope I pronounced that right, Raymond Aron, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., and of course, Henry Kissinger, whom, as you may have recently heard, died this past November at the ripe age of 100. This video intends to focus on its most important section, Part 2, International Politics as a Struggle for Power. International politics is the struggle for power, because no matter the ultimate aims, power is always the immediate aim. Ultimate aims such as freedom, security, and prosperity all require power to come into fruition. This is the universal fact of time. For example, Napoleon wanted to become master of Europe, but without the backing of massive armies, one does not simply walk into Moscow. But what exactly is power? Morgenthau defines power as man's control over the minds and actions of other men. There are two ways this manifests itself: political and military power. Political power is the psychological relationship between those exercising it and those it's being exercised against, through orders, threats, persuasion, or a combination of all three. The former controls the actions of the latter by influencing their minds. Exhibit A, the Duchy of Warsaw, aka Poland Comes Back from the Dead Part 1, adopted the Napoleonic Code because, well, Napoleon. On the other hand, there's military power, Exhibit B. Most of the Italian states adopted the Napoleonic Code because Napoleon physically occupied them, and there's nothing we can do. Military is typically the base/credibility for most political power. Anytime military power is used, it eclipses political power, because the psychological relationship is lost and exchanged for physical violence. The political objective of military preparation is to deter other countries from attacking. The political objective of war is to change the mind of the enemy to yield to the will of the victor. Moving away from the age of Napoleon to the age of Bismarck, not the overhyped fastest ship that ever sailed the sea, on her deck were guns as big as stairs and shells as big as trees. No, the big man himself, Prussian statesman Otto von Bismarck. After the Prussian victory over Austria during the 7 Weeks' War, the Peace of Prague got Austria to yield to the victorious Prussia by dissolving the Austrian-dominated German Confederation, which achieved Bismarck's objective of minimizing Austrian dominance over the German states to open way for German unification under Prussia. Bismarck did not allow the acquisition of Austrian territory, nor Chief of Staff Helmuth von Moltke to organize a victory march through Vienna, because he did not want Austria's humiliation to be enduring and kept it open as a possible future ally. Bismarck's ability to clearly define his objectives and have restraint in their pursuit is what differentiated him from Napoleon. Okay, yep, I'm going to on a rant, so let's save that for another video. Bismarck has a plan. Bismarck always has a plan. Now, Morgenthau explains that there are 3 manifestations of the struggle for power. The first of these is the policy of the status quo, which is defined as a nation whose foreign policy tends towards keeping power and not toward changing the distribution of power in favor pursues a policy of the status quo. Status quo nations seek to maintain the distribution of power existing in a given moment in history. These countries aren't opposed to all change, just changes that will reverse the power dynamics between states. Minor changes in the balance of power relative to the countries are compatible with the policy of the status quo. After the World War I peace treaties, a new status quo was created that replaced Germany with France as the dominant power in Europe. Play the Marseillaise! Play it! Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany lost a large portion of its territory, was disarmed, along with a ton of other clauses Germany viewed as unfair. When Charlie Chaplin's evil twin rose to power in Germany and remilitarized the Rhineland, annexed the ethnically German state of Austria, the not-so-ethnically German state of Czechoslovakia, and the very not ethnically German state of Poland, back from the dead to Electric Boogaloo, evil Charlie Chaplin attempted to claim that his policy was this. Simply solidifying Germany's current position within the status quo. In reality, he was doing this. This is the policy of imperialism. As much as the status quo powers attempt to uphold the permanence of the current balance of power in international relations, like many things in life, nothing gold can stay. A policy of imperialism, as defined by Morgenthau strictly within the balance of power, is a policy that attempts to overthrow the status quo. The state does not try to reinforce positions of power, nor increase its power just a bit, nor increase its power to be equal to its opponents, although it can be argued this is a policy of imperialism because it is not a policy of the status quo, since at this point the status quo power cannot expect to definitively defeat the state. No. The imperialist power is increasing its power to surpass its opponents. Now, there are 3 entry points for the policy of imperialism. First, when 2 states are in conflict, the state that believes it will be victorious will pursue a policy seeking a permanent change between their power dynamics, creating a peace treaty that sets a new status quo in their favor. In World War I, France entered the war defending against Germany's invasion. However, after ending up the victor, they laid out the Treaty of Versailles, outlining agreements that would change the status quo so that Germany was permanently weaker than France, thus morphing France's war into one of imperialism. Second, a state reacting against the successful imperialism of other states. The textbook example of this is my previous example of 30s Germany. Reacting against France's imperialism in the Treaty of Versailles, Germany appeared to make tweaks within the framework of the treaty, but in reality these tweaks altered the power dynamics defined by the treaty, which gave Germany the ability to ultimately overthrow it. And finally, the existence of weak states and politically empty spaces, which are attractive and accessible areas of competition for strong states. The strongest example of this is colonialism. Next, there are 3 goals for imperialism. 1. World domination, or unlimited imperialism, as exemplified by Alexander the Great, yoinking much of the known yoinkable things at the time, and even some of the unknown, but very much yoinkable things. What a yoinkster! Second is hegemony over a continent. This is restrained by geographic limits. This is exemplified by the US over South America during the age of Theodore Roosevelt. During this time period, the Roosevelt Declaration, 1904, was added to the Monroe Doctrine, which stated that the US could intervene in Latin America on the behalf of the international creditors. Wording, "We will land Marines in Latin America to force those states to bend to US interests," in a manner that was polite and acceptable to the other powers. This, along with the Platt Amendment, 1903, an amendment that the US put in Cuba's constitution that gave the US the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, created the US's hegemony over Latin America during this time period. 3. Localized preponderance of power. The limits of this form of imperialism were not necessarily geographic, but rather the objective facts of what is realistic, which going beyond would be technically difficult or unwise. Bismarck, with his tactful ability to restrain Prussia's imperialist policy to what was achievable, pursued this form, establishing German hegemony over Central Europe, mainly through his ability to diplomatically manipulate other powers to create situations favorable to Prussia in ways that were not immediately detectable. Like a boss. No, I'm actually wearing Brooks Brothers I borrowed from my mother. However, in most cases, a country's policy varies depending on the state they are dealing with. While Roosevelt's U.S. was outright imperialistic towards many Latin American countries, it can be argued that the U.S. pursued a policy of the status quo with Argentina and Brazil. Finally, there are 3 methods for imperialism. 1. Imperialism through military is the most ancient, obvious, and crudest method of imperialism. Power dynamics created through conquest can only be changed by war instigated by the vanquished. However, war is also a gamble with extremely high rewards, but also extremely high stakes. Moreover, no dominion can last under pure military might, because military power can't control the livelihoods and minds of its subjects. Thus, its power is not founded on a stable base. That's how Great Britain turned into just Britain. 2nd, economic imperialism is a product of modern times, birthed from mercantilist and capitalist expansion. Economic imperialism comes in the form of policies controlling the people, controlling the country, thus changing the power relations. Compared to military imperialism, economic imperialism is both less intrusive and less effective. However, it is still fairly effective at gaining and maintaining domination in its own right because it can control the livelihoods of foreign people. Sometimes economic imperialism must be supported by another form of imperialism. For about a century up to the time Morgenthau wrote this book, Russia and Great Britain were competing to control Iran, sometimes with military interventions, but mostly economically. Russia had a monopoly on trade and transportation in northern Iran, and Britain along the coast of southern Iran. This competition prevented Iran from being completely absorbed into one country's sphere of influence or freely acting in its own way that benefited Iran in its own right. 3rd, cultural imperialism is theoretically the most stable form of imperialism because it controls the minds of the men as the instrument for changing power relations between 2 states without anything physical. However, in practice, it must be used with another form of imperialism. Its subtleness is used to soften the opponent up for other forms of imperialism. Totalitarian governments are particularly good at exercising this form of imperialism because they have complete control over how they influence citizens and foreign sympathizers. During the interwar period and World War II, communist parties and organizations took orders from Moscow in the institution, cult. I don't know what exactly to call it, but it's called Communist International, which aligned foreign commitments with the interest of the Soviet Unions. Thus, when communists in other countries gained influence in other governments, the Soviet Union also gained influence in these governments. So, how exactly do states counter other states' imperialistic policies? Well, before this step, states must determine whether or not a policy is imperialistic in the first place. It would be fatal to counter a policy of imperialism with measures for the status quo. It is less risky to deal with a policy of adjusting the status quo with measures for imperialism. States should not deal with a policy of imperialism through appeasement because it superimposes a political-like compromise suitable for preserving the status quo on an environment exposed to imperialistic attack where it doesn't belong. The appeaser views the imperialist demand as rationally limited objectives compatible with the status quo, failing to recognize them as links in a chain of events leading to the overthrow of the status quo. If both countries recognizes the status quo, the 2 countries could settle their issues through a compromise. However, if one or both parties have imperialistic policies, this policy will shift power dynamics in favor of the appeased, a bloodless, decisive victory for the imperialist. Moreover, a policy of making changes within the status quo can easily morph into one of imperialism if the appeased views the achievement of their objectives as easy and their opponents as weak. On the other hand, an unsuccessful policy of expansion within the status quo can change into one of imperialism if the state is prevented from achieving its limited objectives, which to them may seem unachievable under the current balance of power. States mistaking a policy of the status quo for one of imperialism may fall into a security dilemma, which is also kind of bad. State A mistakes State B's policy for imperialism, so it resorts to measures like armaments, fortifications, and alliances in regards to State B. State B resorts to countermeasurements because they mistake State A's policy for imperialism, which acts as confirmation to State A that State B seeks a policy of imperialism. The cycle escalates until both countries correct their policies or go to war. It has been argued that the Cold War was a giant security dilemma. The policy of prestige is the least recognized form of the struggle for power because it derived from aristocratic forms and social conventions in the diplomatic world of ceremony, rank, procedure, and empty formalities. Since prestige is not organically tied to international politics, it must be paired with one of the two other policies. Still, the policy of prestige is important because it's intrinsic, as people seek prestige in their own lives as confirmation of their social status. States seek prestige because prestige makes other states bend to their will without needing to exert power. Through reputation, states gain security, wealth, and power they regard their due. Lacedaemon, or I guess Sparta, well technically Sparta only refers to the Spartan settlements, but yeah, okay, it will make sense later, is probably the most successful practitioner of the policy of prestige, to the point where it still bamboozles people to this day. Contrary to popular belief, Lacedaemon was historically very isolationist and avoided conflict whenever possible. In the prelude to the Second Peloponnesian War, when Athens took an imperialistic policy towards Lacedaemon allies like Corinth and Megara, these allies requested assistance from Lacedaemon. It was only after Lacedaemon realized its allies may desert if Lacedaemon did not live up to its reputation that Lacedaemon declared war on Athens. While the individual Spartan was truly a specimen, Lacedaemon, the city-state, was extremely fragile due to its social structure. In Lacedaemon, the total full male Spartiate population was never more than 10,000, and basically their whole personality was being a boot. An entire civilization playing make-believe war for a living is preposterous, childish, impossible, unless if they have hundreds of thousands of helot slave serfs working the land and providing other services. However, the large oppressed helot population left the Spartiates very paranoid about doing anything that would lead the helots to their own devices. Because of this, Lacedaemon depended on its reputed strength from the outside looking in to incentivize other city-states to ally with it and deter them from making trouble. These alliances acted as a necessary physical guarantee for Lacedaemon's continued existence in the face of foreign and domestic, i.e. help suppressing helot revolts, odds. Pursuing prestige for its own sake is rarely the primary objective of international policies, because in international politics, prestige is at most a pleasant byproduct of policies pursuing the substance of power. This is why one-man governments like absolute monarchies should be careful on the international scene, because they sometimes confuse the interests of their countries with personal glory. Looking at you, Kaiser Willy, my boy. This is important because the loss or gain of prestige does impact how other countries regard their country. Usually, prestige is used to support policies of the status quo or imperialism. Foreign policy stems from an estimate about the present and future power dynamics between one's own state and other states. Prestige's primary goal is to influence these estimates so the country with a reputation for prestige can forego using power altogether. In order for this to be successful, the country must have a reputation for unchallengeable power and a reputation for self-restraint in its use. Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared in his 1933 inaugural address the Good Neighbor Policy, which attempted to distance the U.S. from its interventionist phase under the other Roosevelt in Latin America. At this point, the U.S. could forego power in the Western Hemisphere because it had a reputation for unchallengeable power and wanted to develop one of self-restraint to make its hegemony more tolerable towards Latin America. Things such as hosting Pan-American conferences in Latin America allowed Latin American countries to enjoy the appearance of prestige on the diplomatic front. Whoa, Mr. Ford, is it Operation Condor time already? Nope. It's the next section of the chapter. According to Morgenthau, the purpose of the policy of prestige is to impress upon other nations the power one's own nation possesses, or which it believes or wants other nations to believe it possesses. Oh, before I continue, I'd like to add a little fun fact, side note thingy. The terms state and nation have a difference. Whoa, shocking, I know. This is why I don't like to use the term nation unless specifically quoted from Morgenthau. Although they are often misused interchangeably, the definition of state is a self-governing political entity with clear geographic boundaries, example, the US, and the definition of a nation is a large group of people with shared cultural heritage with political aspirations, example, the Kurds. The more you know. Anyways, this is achieved through two main displays. The first kind of display is on the diplomatic front, as the embodiment of their country's respect and insults towards diplomats are respect and insults towards their country. Diplomats act the level of prestige they believe their country to have and are expected to be treated accordingly. In the 1946 Paris victory celebration, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union left the celebration when seated in the second row, while the representatives from the other victorious powers were seated in the first row. After World War II, the Soviet Union was no longer the international pariah, but a great power, and expected to be treated like one. Moreover, the choice for international meetings is another method of demonstrating prestige a country wants or has. When a country has a preponderance of power in a certain field or region, it insists that conferences dealing with these matters are held in or near them. The second is military force. Military strength is a measure of the state's power, and its demonstration attempts to impress other countries with said power. This is done through showing military maneuvers displaying the strength of the country. In areas where claims of a maritime power are challenged by native or external forces, countries will dispatch warships as a symbolic representative of their power. In 1946, at the beginning of the Cold War, the US sent their biggest battleship and most modern aircraft carrier to Italian, Greek, and Turkish ports to demonstrate to the Soviet Union its military might and resolve to defend the status quo in the Eastern Mediterranean. Although countries can and often do pursue a level of prestige that exaggerates the power of their country, this is unwise. While bluffing may reap rewards in the short run, this is only successful as long as the state does not actually use power, which can never be guaranteed. If a country chooses to bluff their prestige, the country should attempt to bring their actual power level to the exaggerated level before the rest of the world catches on. At the other end, it would be a mistake to present a lower reputation of power than what is actually possessed. In this case, enemies would be more inclined to provoke unnecessary conflicts with the state, and the international community overall will take the state less seriously, which could lead to devastating consequences. The best example is the Soviet Union during the interwar period. When confronted with Germany's desire to annex Czechoslovakia in 1938, France and Britain had two choices: allow Germany to annex Czechoslovakia, or check German aggression with the help of the Soviet Union. France and Britain chose the first option because the Soviet Union's prestige was so low. This was further emphasized by the Soviet Union's performance during the Winter War, where it tried and failed to conquer the former Russian Empire Grand Duchy of Finland. Yet with a Molotov cocktail in its right hand, a broken log under its left, skis on its little feet, and the Sekiravin polka ringing through its ears, the technologically and manpower inferior Finland forced the Soviet Union into a stalemate. This confirmed the Soviet weakness to the Allies and gave Germany some ideas, and not very pleasant ones either. To the German General Staff, it seemed to prove that the Soviet Union could not withstand a German attack. This would lead to hundreds of thousands of deaths, I'm Indy Nidell, and welcome to the great final chapter in the struggle for power. Ideology. According to Morgenthau, while all politics is necessary pursuit of power, ideologies render involvement in the contest for power psychologically and morally acceptable to the actors and their audience. In both domestic and foreign politics, the struggle for power veils itself in ethical, legal, or biological necessities on the tongues of statesmen. These bare necessities, the simple bare necessities, can be the ultimate goal of political action or a false front for power, or both. As mentioned before, political power is power over the minds and actions of men. In politics, everyone seeks power over the other, but is simultaneously threatened by others seeking power over them. The seeker of political power will view their ambition over others as just and condemn others seeking power over them as unjust. Up until the 1960s, U.S. Cold War historians mainly held views from the Orthodox school, which aligned with U.S. politicians' claims that the Cold War was started by Soviet imperialism in Eastern Europe, which forced the U.S. to counter. Post-Vietnam War, the revisionist school was popular, which sympathized with the Soviet perspective that U.S. expansion in Western Europe threatened Soviet security. Thus, the logical response was to expand into Eastern Europe. In the past 416 years, the Soviet Union and its various past and present incarnations has been invaded on average every 69 years. No joke. This has been typically done from the West, from countries as distant as Napoleonic France to the neighboring Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as the Soviet Union has no natural borders and the Carpathian Mountains below the North European Plain and northern Baltic Seas above create a natural funnel into the Soviet heartland. From a Soviet perspective, strategic depth was and is necessary compensation for their geographic weakness. Nowadays, most historians believe in the post-revisionist school. What a creative name. Both the Soviet Union and the US pursued policies of imperialism because they both desired power for its own sake, while simultaneously pursuing these policies as a reaction to the security dilemma they were facing. In order to pursue power, it is necessary to use ideologies, because if a statement simply shouts to the international community, "My country wants power, please support us," this request would make pursuing power a whole lot more difficult because it would be denied, and the international community may even unite in their backlash. Moreover, the country that publicly admits this would not be able to pursue power wholeheartedly, because the politicians and people of the country would have a ton of cognitive dissonance working towards something immoral. All in all, ideologies can be used to raise the morale of a country while lowering the morale of opponents as a side effect. In regards to the status quo, this policy can reveal its true nature without hiding behind ideological disguises because of its legitimacy. The status quo is what is currently in practice, therefore it must be favorable in some way. Yet ideologies of permanent peace and international law are the ideologies for the status quo. The ideology of permanent peace puts stigma of warmongering on imperialist opponents, clears countrymen's consciousness of immorality, and rallies all countries hoping to maintain the status quo. Ideologies of international law, unlike domestic law, which have systems that can alter the law, are static. Moreover, international institutions like the League of Nations are established in terms of the current status quo and thus work in its favor. Defense of small nations is another ideology of the status quo, because changes in the status quo are often done at the expense of the Belgians, Finlands, and Polands of the world. On the other hand, imperialism must always be supported by an ideology because it needs to prove that the status quo deserves to be overthrown. The imperialist policy needs to have a higher moral legitimacy. Rather than referring to the static international laws, instead, the imperialist policies refers to the doctrine of a higher natural law of what ought to be. When an imperialist policy is not directed against a certain status quo but into a void, it must appeal to a just natural law against an unjust positive law. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best you breed, go bind thy sons to exile to serve your captives' needs. In other words, the positive law of respecting other human beings is invalid due to the natural law of Europeans being better than everyone, therefore colonialism is just civilizing the natives. I have the receipts from the eugenics fair to prove this. Checkmate, social Darwinist deniers. On the topic of social Darwinism, as Morgenthau is writing his book, at this time period he notes that social Darwinism and other biological arguments have become more prominent in both imperialism to overthrow a status quo and imperialism into the void. Bonus argument that the socially superior state is kept in submission by trickery by socially inferior states and must break free from their chains to achieve their full potential. However, the most common justification for imperialism is anti-imperialism, disguising imperialism as the status quo. This makes your side feel certain about being the good guys and the other side confused. Hashtag gaslight gatekeep girl boss. In 1941, this is what Germany did, justifying their invasion of the Soviet Union as a preemptive attack on the imperialistic Soviet Union. Hans, are we the baddies? Anti-imperialism is an ambiguous ideology that can be used by both status quo states and imperialist states. Yet regardless of this, it is difficult to actually sniff out a policy of imperialism because it is so difficult to determine the true meaning of any human action apart from what the actor believes or feigns it to mean. This is because it is so difficult to distinguish a boast or bluff of a policy from an ideology disguised for imperialism, and to discover the true meaning behind ideology of the status quo or localized imperialism. Morgenthau does not address how this should be done, so instead I will leave you with two thoughts. First, don't listen to the words of governments. Instead, look at what they do and reason from that instead. Second, when attempting to understand the actions of countries, it would be a mistake to treat them like people and ascribe to them the rationale and morals of people. This concludes this episode. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. Have a lovely afternoon. To quote Morgenthau, everyone is a narcissistic psychopath with an agenda. Don't believe every quote you hear on the internet, kids. Thank you so much for watching this YouTube video. This video is about Morgenthau's theory of international relations and does not necessarily reflect my personal beliefs. With every theory or practice I introduce, it is important for you to use your own critical thinking skills to develop your own thoughts about how the world functions. If you learned something new today, which I hope you did so, or simply enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. Once more, thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye!